policy. We're going to talk about taxation. We're going to talk about education. We're going to talk about poverty programs, entitlements. We spent a little bit of time talking about this on Wednesday, especially the entitlements portion in terms of what they're taking up as a part of the budget. But you know what? I walked in here without my phone. Eric, do you have your phone?
Yes, let me pull up attendance.
Thank you. I appreciate that. I'm sorry. I guess I also need it for the poll, so I'm going to go get it while you're running attendance. But the big announcement is this. The final prompt is going to be posted for the essay, is going to be posted this afternoon. My fellows have all signed off on it. And so everyone is in agreement this is what we should do. And so attendance is live right now. It'll be posted tonight. It's only one question. It's worth more, so you need to write more. You'll have more time on the final. Your final is partially comprehensive, okay? So remember that. And also remember to log in from the left side of Cengage on your attendance app. So, okay. I think that's all I have for announcements. You guys are doing attendance. I'm grabbing my phone so that I'll be ready for the poll. And then I'm going to talk to you about taxation. So let me get that ready.
Oh, if some of us TAs put your grades in a little early on participation and all that before this morning, we're working to fix that. We had a scale issue, but we'll get all that fixed. So don't worry about that. It will all be fixed.
Yeah, I had the scale a little bit off. The workbook was worth about 20% more than it should have been worth, I think, or something like that. It's worth 240 points instead of 200 points. So we have adjusted those, or I adjusted those this morning. It was pointed out to me that I was off on that. So it has been corrected. Any other announcements you guys want to give?
Any questions? Anything you're dying to know?
What's the meaning of life?
Totalitarian dictator. I give you that, but
the final will open at 8 a.m. and it will close at midnight. I think probably Eric was just answering that, but I thought I would as well.
I was answering the meaning of life, actually.
Oh, well, all right.
Close. Yeah.
Right. So there we go. Now I think attendance is still got just a second. The final has one essay question and all the rest is multiple choice. Okay, so one essay question and then multiple choice. The style will be similar to the other exams where you have many multiple choice questions. You'll have about 50, and then you'll have one essay though instead of two. So it's a longer essay. And like I said, that prompt will be up later this afternoon.
Wow, we have more people in attendance than we do in this class. I am just dual personalities are coming out today.
That's interesting.
Oh, like 20 more.
Huh. Well, I don't know how that's possible, but there you have it. Okay. Let me go back. I hit something that I should not have hit. I'm gonna have to escape out. You ready for them to escape? Okay. Okay, so domestic policy. The first thing I want to talk about is taxation. There are three types of taxation in your questions there. That's the first question. What are the types of taxation? There are three types. There's progressive, proportional, and regressive. I'll talk a little bit about income tax credit in just a second, but progressive, proportional, and regressive. In a progressive tax, people with higher incomes are going to pay a greater share of their income in taxation. So for example, if you are making $20,000 a year, you may pay 5% tax rate. If you're making $30,000 a year, you may pay a 7.5% tax rate. If you're making $40,000, you may pay a 10% tax rate. If you're making $50,000, a 12.5% tax rate. If you're making $60,000, a 15% tax rate, etc. Okay, and we're going to talk about this in a minute. The vast majority of people pay 15% or less in terms of their tax rate, but a progressive tax is what we see on our income taxes. As I spoke about on Wednesday, one of the issues with that is that there are many tax loopholes or tax credits that you get. As a result of that, people do not pay a straight progressive tax. And the middle class ends up bearing much more of the burden for taxation than any other group. Particularly the wealthy tend to pay a lower tax rate than those who are at lower rates because of those tax loopholes. A proportional tax is when all people pay the same share of their income. So for example, across all of those, if I'm making $20,000, I pay $2,000 in taxes. If I'm making $80,000, I pay $8,000 in taxes at a 10% proportional tax rate. The big issue with that is mainly that the rate would have to be much higher, I think at about 22 to 25% for it to work, for it to do the revenue that is necessary to come in. But we're going to talk about in a second how that works out in terms of taxation. A regressive tax is the opposite of a progressive tax. In other words, the less money you make, the more of your income is taxed. The perfect example of this is a sales tax. Because the less money you make, the more money you have to spend in order to survive. So you don't put it in a savings or you don't invest it. Instead, you spend that money, you spend it on rent, which is taxed. With sales tax, you spend it on food, spend it on clothing. You have to use all of that money. And so you're taxed more than someone who has already put away. For example, with my income, I put away 10% into a 401k before it even comes home, right? And then if I have an opportunity to save some of that, another 10% on a good month, but really that rarely happens, then that isn't taxed, right? But my money that I'm paying on my mortgage, that interest isn't taxed, and I actually get that back. And so a regressive tax means that people who who make less money are actually paying more in taxes. The way that our taxation schemes in the United States work out is that we really pay kind of a proportional tax up to a certain income bracket. At a certain point, those with really high incomes pay a lower tax rate than the rest of us. But we pay a pretty flat proportional tax because you're taxed more with sales taxes, local taxes, state taxes at a lower income, and you are taxed at a higher rate through income tax. So an income tax credit, that's a negative income tax, and it's going to provide income to very poor working people. It's about $6,000 if you have 3 or more children. That is to give you something back to help supplement your income if you have children. So that's only an earned income tax credit. You have to be working. So you're working, say, full-time, or you're working more than 30 hours a week, then you have children, and you qualify for an earned income tax credit. There we go. These are US tax rates as compared to the OECD. Those are the other most developed nations in the world. We are below the average at 31.7% tax rates on labor income, and that's including things like our tax rates for deduction, our payroll tax deductions. So for unemployment insurance, Social Security, and Medicare, 31.7% as a percentage of labor costs is what we pay in. So if you'll see, the other countries in the OECD are much higher for the most part, with the exception of, Mexico is lower. Also, Australia and New Zealand are down there below us. Most taxpayers in the United States are in the 15% tax bracket or lower, okay? And those are those first three columns. The 25% tax bracket is pretty low. If you add to it all the other tax brackets, everybody else who is in those tax brackets, you still do not reach those people who are paying 0% taxes, and it's only a little higher than those who are paying 10% tax brackets. Those in the 15% tax bracket, those are the middle class, along with the 10%, and they are bearing the brunt of taxation. So, social welfare, what is that exactly? These are policies that provide benefits directly to individuals. So, for example, a road is not social welfare, but education is social welfare, because many people are using that road. You may never use that road at all, okay? But your education is something that is particular to you. It is yours. So whenever you graduate from high school, that's your high school diploma. When you graduate from college, that is your college education. All right. Poverty, there are some poverty programs that exist, which we will talk about very briefly. Things like SNAP, things like temporary assistance to needy families. The maximum amount of time that you can receive that over your lifetime is 5 years, and you can only receive it for 2 years in a row. Social Security, this is something that is an individual benefit we pay in out of our payroll taxes. Healthcare, an individual benefit. It may be an entitlement if it's Medicare. It may be means tested if it's Medicaid. It's an entitlement if it's veterans. Veterans get lots of entitlements. And then it's means tested if it's like if you fall under the ACA, the Affordable Care Act, and you get a partial aid with that. The largest social welfare policies are Social Security and Medicare, and 90% of Americans approve of those programs. It's actually something like 89.7%, but trust me, it's a lot, okay? 90% of Americans approve of Social Security and Medicare. The vast majority of social welfare recipients are not poor. And I want to repeat this to you again. The vast majority of people who receive social welfare benefits are not poor. They do not fall below the poverty line. 5/6 of all money goes to entitlement programs, people who are going to benefit regardless of income and wealth. So, social welfare is something that is, however, controversial. And the question is, why? I just told you that 90% of people, hey, they really approve of these benefits, Social Security and Medicare, and those are the biggest social welfare programs. Well, let's look. Entitlement programs, government benefits that certain qualified individuals are entitled to by law, regardless of need. These include Social Security, Medicare, veterans benefits, student loans, right? The guaranteed student loans. These are all a part of that. Also, unemployment insurance. You pay into it, and if you've paid into it, you receive it. These are entitlement programs. Means tested programs are government programs only available to individuals below a poverty line. okay? And so I want to point out that means tested, it's 15% of the total budget, all means tested programs together. Those are subsidies from the ACA, that's Medicaid, which is a big chunk, right? That's temporary aid for needy family, that's SNAP benefits for children, that's all of those things, 15% of the total budget. But 45% of the total budget goes to entitlements. We tend to, however, judge as a people our view of social welfare based upon means tested programs only. And we have a really bad attitude about it. So how many of you are watching Falcon and the Winter Soldier right now? Falcon and the Winter Soldier. Blaine is in. Katie. All right. Blake, Kylie, Caitlin. All right. A few of you. Okay. So a few of you are watching Falcon and the Winter Soldier. What's the big controversy, right? What's the big controversy? Why is there this big bad? What's going on? Global Repatriation Act, exactly, right? There are people who are angry that there are a group of people who disappeared for 5 years and came back, and that governments are spending money to aid them. But the other people who were there the whole time aren't getting aided, are not receiving aid. And so they're angry about this. And this is the same thing we see with means tested programs. People say, this isn't fair. They shouldn't get it because I didn't get it, right? And it's exactly that attitude. So this is how we spend our money. You guys had already seen a pie chart like this. It's broken up a little bit differently, but it's essentially the same. Health, that includes both Medicare and Medicaid and any subsidies for veterans or any subsidies for under the ACA. So veterans also gets 4% on their own, which is separate, okay? Defense and Homeland Security, 16%, Social Security, 25%. But you can see a lot of these get very, very small amounts. That remainder, 9.1%, about 2/3 of that is interest on the debt. So education policy, it's mostly entitlement. There's some means tested. So for example, if you receive a Pell Grant, that would be a means tested grant. But if you receive VA, the GI Bill, then the GI Bill is going to be entitlement. If you get your student loans covered while you're in college in terms of interest, that's entitlement. Grants are mostly entitlement. Education policy is a subset which provides standards for course materials for K through 12, but also for colleges. It mandates days spent in school, it provides funding, and it requires adequate yearly progress. It tends to grade districts on their performance. At the state and federal level, policy control is tightly contested, okay? And so, for example, there may be a movement at the federal level to get states to do something. And I want to note something that requires adequate yearly progress varies from program to program. The current program that we're in requires that states create a system that systematically talks about how they are doing. That's it. It doesn't have to be testing. It can be something else, but most default to testing. Two subsets of higher ed policy. One's higher ed, and that's mainly, like I said, individual transfers of money, and also grants, so some research in there as well. And then common ed, which is more on standards, and that money goes directly to states and districts from the federal government. There have been 4 major education policies at the federal level. The first was the National Defense Education Act of 1951. 1958, sorry. The whole purpose of it was to get us to the moon. Seriously. And to be sure that we did not lose the technological race with the Soviet Union. So it focused on science and math in particular. The purpose was that the idea was our national defense was at stake if we fell behind other countries in terms of technology. The Elementary and Secondary Education Act of 1965 stuck with those basic ideas, but also added in a liberal arts and critical thinking component. So we see changes there in the ESEA. In 2001, there is an attempt to revamp federal policy whenever it comes to the way that money is given. So No Child Left Behind is passed in 2001 and implemented in 2002. The major difference is this. There had always been some level of testing. How are we doing? Is this working? What are some programs we can use? But with No Child Left Behind, the testing became punitive in nature. If you do not test above certain levels, then you lost money, and your schools were closed down as a result of it. So you see in the first places where this is implemented, which is actually the state of Texas. Texas did it as a state program first, and George W. Bush took it as president as something he wanted to do at the federal level, and it passed bipartisan, lots of support. But in Texas, it looked like it worked, right? Hey, if you're failing, we're going to give you a little extra money to help you out, but if that doesn't work, then we're shutting you down, we're taking the money away, okay? And it looked like it worked in Texas. It turns out years later, it's discovered that all those schools in Texas that were failing were cooking their books so that they did not lose their funding. And this is the same thing that schools were doing across. First of all, teachers started teaching to the test instead of helping you learn how to think. And so students were not doing as well as they had before, and it was just more problematic. No Child Left Behind creates a big problem in terms of education. Every Student Succeeds Act is passed in 2015. It backs off of the punitive nature, but it doesn't give a good replacement to states, because states, as much as they complain about the federal government dictating what they're supposed to do, generally they don't want to invent it themselves. And so they go with what they have. So we still see almost as much testing as we did before. We see the same policies of teaching toward the test. And this is a big problem, that even though that punitive element has been removed, testing is very much the center of this process. So now I'm going to talk to you a little bit about poverty. And to understand poverty, I need for you to understand income and wealth, okay? Income is the amount of money collected between any 2 points in time. My weekly income, my monthly income, my yearly income, right? Income is the amount of money that I collect between any 2 points in time. At the University of Oklahoma, you can go online and you can look at my salary, and you'll see that I make $50,000 a year, okay? Because I am not a tenure track professor. I am a term lecturer. I have a PhD in political science, but my responsibilities are different, okay, than a tenure track professor. So my income is a little lower. That's my income. My wealth is the total amount of assets that I own, to include stocks, bonds, bank accounts, cars, real estate. So that includes the things that I've been given from my parents, generational wealth. And when we talk about generational wealth, I want you to understand, I'm also talking about the ability to give your 18-year-old a car or a used car when they go off to college or whenever they graduate from high school, so that they can make a living, right? So generational wealth can be even at that low level. Generational wealth might also be Bigger, obviously, millions of dollars, hundreds of thousands of dollars. Sadly, my family does not have that kind of generational wealth, but nonetheless, they were able to do things for me, like provide a vehicle, like provide support whenever I was in college, things like that, that made a real difference. Even to the point that whenever I was starting a new business, I could look to my family and get a short-term loan to be able to do what I needed to do. Wealth is the total amount of assets owned, everything. One of the keys to a successful democratic process is a large middle class. When you do not have the ability to transfer wealth of any kind, then people start over from the very beginning. And it's very difficult, certainly on a minimum wage, full-time salary, to be able to accumulate wealth and to attain the middle class. Bill Gates is going to own an amount equal in terms of wealth to that owned by the poorest 40% of the country. Now, you say, well, they're poor. Well, no, they're not. Anything above about 25% is middle class. So 15% of middle class, 25% of the poorer people in the United States, he's going to own by himself an amount equal to what they own. Those are all the things, right? Their telephones, their computer mouses, right? Their amazing, collection of things on their wall, all of those things. The next thing I need you to understand about poverty is that more than half of all working Americans are going to dip below the poverty line for at least a year during their lifetimes. More than half. And so at least a year. And so I'm talking about a year when you get laid off, a year whenever maybe your spouse is sick, and so you take off to take care of them. More than half of all people are going to dip below the poverty line for at least a year during their lifetimes. Only 10% of people who are eligible for means-tested aid use it for more than 5 years in their lifetime. This is when they could. This is prior to 1996 when the laws changed. And in 2018, 13.9% of Americans lived below the poverty line. That's 25,000 for a family of 4 and 12,000 for a single person. So I want you to think about your part-time jobs, and that's $1,000 a month. That's $250 a week. As a single person, that's the poverty line. In 2020, I'm going to show you a graph in just a second of how that changed. Low income and the poor make up about 43.5% of the population. And only 20% of those who are below the poverty line, that 13.9%, only 20% of those actually receive assistance. This means tested assistance, SNAP, TANF, etc. So here is the percent of non-elderly individuals living in families with combined weekly earnings below the poverty line. This is February of 2020, and that's June of 2020. The pandemic had a massive impact. So among all people, it moves people from 20% of the, or right under 20%, I think it was like 19.8% living below the poverty line, to 26%. From a fifth to a fourth. Among white Americans, that's going to increase from about 17% to 21%. Among Black Americans, from about 27% to 37%, 38%. Among Latinos, that's going to be about 22.5% to 31%. And among Asians, from about 11% way up to 23%. And I want you just to look at that. I think that one's a particularly interesting. It more than doubles during the pandemic. Our poverty rate from 1959 to 2015, the official poverty measure is that blue line. And as you see, we have stayed pretty steadily since the late 1960s, that war on poverty that was put forth by LBJ, Lyndon Baines Johnson. We've stayed pretty steadily below 15%, but we keep bumping up against it. So we dipped down pretty low where we got down to about 11%, and we have rarely achieved that again. Right at 2000, we had that booming 90s economy where you see the poverty line just flow, and then we have that crash in 2002, and we've seen increases since. As I was saying, the poverty line, the poverty rate was up at 19.9% by 2020. Okay, so it increased pretty dramatically. That's actually not true. Sorry, that's not true. It was at 13.9% in 2018. And in 2019, those who were not elderly, so weren't receiving Social Security, it was at 19.9. I apologize. So the question is how do we address this? Well, we address it according to the way people view poverty, right? And so Americans' attitude on poverty is pretty straightforward. Government should help. And then it's not very straightforward. The poor are not trying hard enough. They think that people should take personal responsibility for themselves. So government should help, but only the deserving poor, right? Whites' attitudes are strongly influenced by their view of non-whites. It's very strongly connected to race. If you are white and you believe that people who are not white are lazy, then you are less likely to support welfare programs. And part of that is tied to the fact that the media portrays 3/4 of welfare recipients as African Americans, when in fact it's about 20% of recipients, right? So the portrayal is 3 out of 4 or 75%, when in fact it's 20%. There are some problems in terms of the number of people in poverty by race. Certainly, if you're non-Hispanic white, you have primarily stayed below that 10% margin of poverty line. Asian Americans began dropping in the 1980s, and we're very, very close to non-Hispanic whites, and then there was a new categorization, and we see some changes. The Asian poverty rate increases in 2013. The Hispanic ethnicity, that's going to be also at a much higher rate. But one of the important things that we're tracking here is prior to the war on poverty, and this is one of the reasons why it's really linked in people's minds, 55.1% of Black Americans lived in poverty. The war on poverty dramatically changes that. But African Americans are still more likely to live in poverty than any other group but Native Americans. In 2019, these are the poverty rates. 26.2% of Native Americans lived in poverty in 2019. 22% of Latinos, 21.6% of African Americans, 14.7% of Asian Americans, and 9.9% of non-Hispanic whites. There's clearly a racial element to poverty. They are connected together. In addition to this, 51% of K through 12 children live below the poverty line. And I want you guys to think about that. More than half of children live below the poverty line. Let's go back to those American attitudes. Government should help, but the poor aren't doing enough. My question for you is, what exactly is it that that 8-year-old is supposed to be doing? There's some opposing views on what causes poverty. One is this idea that there's a culture of poverty, that there are negative attitudes and values toward work, family, and success that condemn people to the lower levels of accomplishment. And David, coal mines no longer are allowed to hire children. So it's begging in the streets is the option.
The good old days.
The poor are present-oriented, lack self-control, exhibit poor work habits, lack positive aspirations, and have weak family structures and relationships. The other view is that people grow up in hostile environments. There's racial discrimination, social and cultural customs that keep people in a continual cycle of poverty, and educational limits. One thing I really need for you to remember is this: statistically, the primary link to disparity in income is unequal access to quality education. Hostile Environments argues that people are poor because of external barriers to their success. There was a study, it was a 10-year study in the 1980s that followed people from all walks of life, all classes across. And what they found is that there was no culture of poverty, that people were just as likely to be rich and lazy as they were to be poor and lazy, or middle class and lazy. There was no culture of poverty. They could not find that link. They could not find that people were less likely to be attached to their family if they were poor as opposed to wealthy. So this is how the American population really is. Right now, about 55% of us are working. Another 5% are in school. Some are doing both. Then there is another chunk, 20%, that are retired, okay? And that leaves homemakers and disabled, about 4% each, about 8%. And then looking for work versus not looking for work. About 3% of the or actually about 2% of the population is actively looking for work, or 3% looking for work, and 2% not looking for work. I want you to think about that, because more work does not equal less poverty. The United States has more people as a percentage in the workforce who work longer hours than any other industrialized country, and it has more poverty than every other industrialized country. Unemployment insurance is an entitlement. We pay into it and we get back from it if we lose our job because of something out of our control. US workers work more than any other industrialized country. We're more productive than any other nation. The OECD average is 51.1%, or 51.1 in terms of GDP per hour worked. Ours is 68.3. One of the key things is old age insurance as well. Social Security is an entitlement, as I told you. During the Great Depression, Social Security was crafted. And it was crafted with this idea that the big problem, the poorest people in the nation, were the elderly. They no longer are, by the way. The poorest people in the nation are children. But the elderly could not support themselves, they couldn't work. And so Social Security was created to deal with that. Franklin Delano Roosevelt called it a politically indestructible program. And he's right. Social Security has grown rapidly since 1935. We add Medicare to that in 1965, so that's health insurance as well. Both employers and employees contribute, so you give money to that. You get a statement each year from Social Security that tells you how much you've got in your Social Security trust fund. The trust fund overall is used to pay benefits and to loan money to the government. A great amount of the national debt is debt money that we owe ourselves. We have taken it from the trust fund and we have not paid it back. As I talked about on Wednesday, the ratio of workers to beneficiaries is narrowing. The trust fund will be in the red unless it is paid back or unless we do something about changing those numbers. Again, remember in 1935, the average life expectancy was 65. That's when you can start collecting Social Security. Today, the average life expectancy is greater than 75. In terms of health, that takes up 30% of our total budget. It's huge. That includes Medicare, Medicaid, veterans benefits, and the Affordable Care Act. About 7.5% of that goes directly to veterans. It's a pretty big chunk. That is, again, an entitlement, okay? That's a retirement benefit for serving in the military. About 6% are subsidies under the ACA, the Affordable Care Act. That would be a means tested, okay? People who fall below a certain level, and so therefore get a subsidy to help them pay for health insurance. So they're paying part. Less than 1% is the CDC, the FDA, the USDA, all those agencies that try to help prevent disease, who approve drug use, who ensure that food is safe, those sort of things. And 21% goes directly to children, okay? So of that 30%, 7.5% of that goes to veterans, 6% goes to ACA, 0.5% goes there, and 21% go to children, and 15% go to Medicaid, and 50% of it goes to Medicare, okay? And Medicare, again, children and Medicaid are going to be means tested programs. Medicare is going to be an entitlement. We have paid in, and so therefore we are receiving. So I have a poll for you. You may not prefer any of these, that's fine. I'm just asking you which one you prefer out of out of these, which you prefer the most. And so all right, that poll is live now. Yeah, it's live. And so I just want to sum up, okay? You can respond in there if you want, but remember, with your Cengage app on your phone, if you go over to the left and do courses, then it works better, okay? So I'm going to sum up a little bit about understanding the social welfare policy as you guys finish this poll. The first thing you should know is this. The growth of the federal government has been driven by the growth of social welfare policies. As we become more democratic, we have demanded that government do more. The American social welfare system grew until the 1980s when it was scaled back. So the amount of people who receive benefits has decreased, but the amount spent continues to grow because of Social Security and Medicare, those entitlement programs. We do not have as many means tested programs as we did with the war on poverty under LBJ. Ronald Reagan began a war on poverty, and so scaled back many of those programs. One of the key things about democracy is this: the more active we are, the more we want government to give us the benefits that we need to do those basic things that we talked about in the very first class. The rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. To be all that we can be, we're asking that government ensure that there is broadband access and clean water and infrastructure and, a living wage, those sort of things. Democracy means that there are more demands on government. The US has the smallest social welfare system out of all Western democratic nations. And there is considerably unequal political participation by those that use the programs. In particular, those who use Medicare and Social Security are much more likely to be politically active. Veterans are much more likely to be politically active. than are the working poor. They don't have time. They're making, $7 an hour, and they're supporting kids, and, they're trying to get by. They are less likely to be active. All right. So it looks like there's only 116 people who can take a poll, however. There's more in class, but only that many take a poll. So I'm completing the poll.
I think next semester we'll have location accuracy, so we know if they're in class.
Well, the thing is, we can't do that sadly with this, and so that's what we did do when we were in a classroom.
Yeah.
My results are loading very, very slowly. Eric, can you see yours?
Yeah, let me check. Domestic policy, old age protection 6%, children's aid 19%, education 49%, poverty relief 26%.
Okay, that's a little bit different than my first class. My first class put education first, just as you did, but they put children second, poverty third, and you're about the same with old age protection. It's pretty typical in my college classes, about 4 to 5%, and you guys were 6%, so you're a little bit high, are going to support that as well. All right, so that is all for today.